Today, I'm going to show you what you can do to take images like these. Images that will hopefully capture your imagination, make you pause, take notice, and get you to engage, if only for a moment. These are the kind of images that can end up on front covers of books and magazines all around the world. So please do subscribe if you'd like to learn more. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Andy Parkinson and I'm a National Geographic photographer and Nikon Europe ambassador, and today we are talking animal portraits with impact. And if you stay to the end of this video, then I'm going to share with you one of the most memorable encounters that I've ever had, and it happened with a tiger. So what attributes make images like these? Well, for me, it's a combination of many different factors, but I think that for an image to have impact, it needs to have at least one of the following 6 elements. A good quality of light, direct eye contact, you want to try and reveal the character or the personality of the subject. Ideally, it's often best if it's photographed from a low angle or from an eye level perspective. Sometimes it helps if you photograph the animal full frame or up close. And additionally, sometimes you want to have a unique creative interpretation, a different way of shooting. Of course, the more of those individual elements that the images contain, the stronger and the more dramatic they are likely to be. So let's look at them individually, and then at the end of this video, you can decide which ones that you think are the most important. And please do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, as there's a lot to cover in this subject, I'm actually going to produce this video in 2 parts. Part 1 today is going to cover the first 3 elements. The next 3 elements we'll cover next week in part 2. Light. This is always my number 1 criteria when it comes to my own wildlife photography, simply because of the transformative effect that I know its presence can have on the resulting images. One of my favourite approaches is to try and capture images of my subjects in dappled forest light, but only when the sun is illuminating the subject. Even if it's just a small part of the animal's face, like with this red fox cub close to my home. When this happens, by exposing for the sunlit subject the shadowed, darker areas which would have required a much longer exposure, falls into dramatic underexposure, simply because the shutter is not left open long enough to let the required amount of light in. This way, we can exploit the camera's inability to record detail in high contrast light and shadow simultaneously, thereby exaggerating the effect and making the image much more dramatic than it would have appeared to the naked eye. This is a really useful tip for those that are looking to produce these kinds of dramatic portraits, or simply to learn more about the fall of light and how we can use our cameras to maximise its effects. I'd encourage you to get out and try this technique with common, accessible subjects, which around here would be species like grey squirrels, badgers or foxes. And my technique, my process is simple. I always shoot in manual exposure because my mirrorless Nikon Z9 has a live viewfinder, which means that I can see the effect of my exposure as I shoot, to see if it is too light or too dark. I then commit to only shoot when the animal is in a pool of dappled sunlight, as this will always produce the most dramatic images. In contrast to what I can capture this way, it would be pointless for me to photograph the fox when he is lurking in the shadows, as the images will never compare. I'm going to do a video on this technique in future weeks, as there is a lot to unpack. Another reason why I love working with foxes so much is because of their wily, suspicious nature. Historic and senseless persecution of this iconic species has only served to heighten their secretive nature, and so when working with them, even though I always work from a hide or blind, they will still somehow be aware of something, often staring intently in my direction. This brings me to the next important attribute for impact portraits, and that is the importance of eye contact. Eye contact can really make or break an image, giving us an insight into how the animal is feeling, and also a sense of connection between us and them. As this bear strode menacingly in my direction on a remote Alaskan beach, I made a mistake which I want to share with you quickly so that I can hopefully prevent you from ever doing the same thing. Pre-trip, I had not upgraded my memory cards, and so they were too slow for my camera. And so, in this astonishingly memorable moment, undoubtedly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I kept hitting the camera's buffer. This meant that I could only take one measly, painful image at a time, and so I had little alternative but to try and time each shot for when the bear's foot landed in the water. This encounter, by contrast, was more of a nothing encounter, but it again shows the importance of shooting regardless. This bear was simply wandering off with his catch in relatively harsh light, but with no negative consequence for me, other than maybe some time spent deleting. I photographed anyway. In that moment the bear turned, invited me to try and steal his fish, and a memorable image was captured. This is an important point. An enormous amount of what I have learned over the years has been from shooting, even when the quality of the opportunity is not always obvious. It only takes a split second for an image to be born, so be ready and keep your eye to the viewfinder. Pay particular attention to your subject's eyes, as this will give you an insight into how they are feeling, and this will also ensure that you are ready if something suddenly begins to unfold. It's important as well to ensure that you look through all of your images, as so often a hidden gem of an expression can be tucked away, like with this young giant river otter in Brazil recently, who momentarily looks less than impressed with something. And this brings me to the third and final element in this first of two-part video, that is, trying to reveal something of the character or personality of the animal. Now this tends to be something that happens organically, as opposed to something that you set out to achieve, but recognizing aspects of behavior that will add qualities or personality to our images is a good starting point. Nile monitors are not particularly menacing creatures, but they can certainly be made to look so when photographed a certain way, especially if they are peering down on you from a roadside tree, their flicking tongue tasting the air. Sometimes it might be the incomparable absurdity of the animal's appearance that makes for a characterful image, like this giant anteater that for one brief moment doesn't have his prominently protruding proboscis wedged in the nearest termite mound. Or it might simply be a momentary look of startled surprise from a subadult mountain hare in its summer pelage. Mountain hares are notorious for this bewildering but entertaining behaviour, as I've spent many hundreds of hours lying in close proximity to them, and easily visible ever present. Nevertheless, at some point, several hours in, they will suddenly look at me like I've just beamed down from another planet. Which of course is ideal if you're trying to produce memorable or compelling portraits. When it comes to the ability to reveal personality traits or the characters of our subjects, then these opportunities are more easily found, if only because we can apply our own human emotions to the situations in which we see them. It might be the comforting touch that an infant elephant, just a few days old, seeks from her attentive but ferociously protective mother. Or the vulnerability of a young fox cub out alone, tentatively exploring the fields close to its maternal den, perhaps for the first time. It might even be the indignance of a grey squirrel, arms folded, decidedly unimpressed by the presence of a nearby paparazzo. Meanwhile, further afield, in the pristine wilds of the remote Kamchatka Peninsula, we might be awed by the second largest brown bear on Earth, the sheer size and scale of the bear emphasised by the eye-level perspective and the tight framing. But those two elements we shall encounter in part 2 next week, when we also explore how we can incorporate creativity when trying to create compelling and memorable portraits. For now, as I promised at the beginning of this video, I want to tell you about the one and only time that, in 17 years of working with tigers, that one of them has taken too much of an interest in me. It happened because as two tigers, a brother and sister, suddenly emerged onto the forest track, I moved too quickly and too eagerly from my standing position at the back of the Jeep to retrieve my camera equipment. My movement triggered in the young male tiger, seen here, an immediate predatory response that required us to be particularly careful in his presence. It's worth noting that at the time, our vehicle had no doors, no windows, no sides, no windscreen. It was, to all intents and purposes, a dinner plate with 4 wheels. And in this image here, though the light is abysmal, you can still clearly see from his eyes that he's far too interested in me. But it was actually the final image, which I will show shortly, when he lay crouched, poised on a roadside rock slightly above us, that I was most paralysed. Worse still, I could see a really annoying piece of sunlit vegetation between him and I, and whilst I've tried to minimise it as much as possible, it's still a really irritating flaw. Nevertheless, I was so convinced in the moment that even the slightest movement from me might trigger a response that I simply remained motionless, paralysed to the spot, muttering vegetation-related obscenities to my amused uncle who sat immediately to my left, gloating in whispered tones about his unencumbered view. But that is so often the way with photography. It is in the imperfections that the real story lies. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Part 2 is going to come next week. Please do consider subscribing to support this channel. It's always free. So thanks again, and bye for now.